Hey everyone, welcome back to DAIZYCHAIN. For this video, I'm taking a break from the clay and getting my apprenticeship in carpentry. I'm making a wooden fire temple from Ari Aster's Midsommar. So Midsommar tells the story of a group of college students, Christian, Mark, Josh and Pele, as they embark on a sex romp to Sweden. But Christian's bummer of a girlfriend decides to tag along.
Don't want her back.
I might.
See? You could be getting that girl pregnant right now.
Don't forget about all the Swedish women.
Don't forget about all the Swedish milkmaids.
I invited Danny to come to Sweden.
You just took these 5 minutes
At least
ago.
that's what I think the movie's about.
Josh,
I
can
ended
you
up
lie down,
falling
please?
asleep pretty early on and woke up to the temple on fire. So they must have got up to some pretty crazy stuff. But the temple looked cool, so I decided to make it. So you're going to need a lot of popsicle sticks for this one. I started with the two walls, which is basically a bunch of sticks glued on top of each other. I decided to include some structural vertical planks with the hope that with the light shining within, it looked a bit more accurate. Hot tip, if you can tape the sticks together horizontally with some painter's tape, it's much easier to glue down the vertical ones. With this method, I was easily able to complete the front and the rear temple pretty quickly. I marked out the windows and the entrance and cut everything to shape. So it was at this point in the build that I decided to rewatch the final scene, which is where I realized my critical mistake. The sides of the building are triangle too, not just the face. So it was at this point I had two options. It was a tough choice, but after a few hours of angrily rebuilding, I'm back to where I was. So now that we've caught up, for the detailing around the window frame, I cut some thin balsa wood at 45-degree angles using matchsticks for reference and gluing them into place. The main entrance framing were coffee stirrers and a thin trim of balsa wood. The geometry of the building is mostly equilateral triangles, so it was easy to keep things quite consistent. For the community insignia, I used thin balsa wood cut into matchstick lengths. I originally tried to create a solid piece, but working to this scale with brittle wood like balsa doesn't really work, but I think it turned out pretty well. As for the doors, just an equilateral triangle split down the middle, and using some more thin balsa, I could add the barn door looking details. With the wooden doors finished, the construction of the temple was complete. Now let's get painting. I lined the inside of the temple with painter's tape and gave the whole building a white prime. After this, I painted the temple a bright yellow base coat and the doors a light blue. When the base coat had dried, I found it to be offensively yellow, so to pull back on some of the vibrancy, I gave the whole temple, including the doors, a black wash. Not only did this mute the colours a bit more, but also brought out some of the wood grain. After this, then I had to pull out some of the darkness from the wash with some thinner, before I brought back the colour with multiple layers of yellow. In hindsight, I should have done a pin wash. This is where the wash is applied just to small areas and details like corners, because it took a lot of yellow to bring back the colour. Now for the base. I took the framing off some cheap 6-inch canvases and increased the height with some foam board. I needed the base to be tall enough to conceal the wiring and a 9-volt battery. Top layer, I just used a 6-inch gesso board, which was sturdy enough to build off. I marked out where I wanted the temple to go, as well as the LEDs and the incense hole, and finished it all off with some off-screen soldering. Now for the incense burner. Obviously, heat was a big consideration, and fire and wood go pretty well together, which is great for Neanderthals, but not those of us trying to make an incense burner without setting our house on fire. So for this, I decided to make the incense holder out of plaster, as it's not flammable and has a very high heat tolerance. For the plaster mold, I used a rolling pin for the internal diameter and a cookie cutter for the external, and built up the shape into that of a burning incense. Hot tip, never make a mold out of plaster, it just makes demolding too difficult. I'll be making another incense holder in a few projects which I'll use silicone for. Returning back to the base, I sealed this with Mod Podge and applied a rough layer of molding paste. I find this breaks up the surface so it's not as flat. Once this had all dried, I painted it a light green in preparation for the static grass. Now to make sure that I can remove the incense burner, but ensure that it follows the diorama if I need to move it, I added stir sticks underneath for it to rest on. When the light green base coat had dried, I laid down some glue for the sand. I placed some random patches and a more deliberate path leading up to the entrance of the temple. After knocking off all the excess sand, I did a heavy coat of glue for the static grass. When I was happy with the coverage of grass, I made up a combination of water, Mod Podge and alcohol and sprayed this all over the surface to lock everything into place. I glued on my now dried doors to the temple, and to finish off the build, I lined the edges of the base with more balsa. Gluing stir sticks to the back of the panel allowed me to fill in any deficits so the bolster sits flush. For a final touch and some extra pizzazz, I glued together some matchsticks to all 4 corners of the base, before finishing it all off with a coat of black paint. Overall, I'm happy with how this turned out. My next diorama, I'll do a little bit more research into lighting and how to perfect the incense burner. If you've made it this far, I hope you enjoyed it too. Please like and subscribe, and if there's anything else you'd like to see, please leave in the comments below. Cheers.